Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today what we're going to be taking a look at is matchup data. So we are on the Limitless.com platform, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at all of the top decks in this new Shining Revelry format, and then we're going to take a look at what decks they do well against and what decks that they don't do well against, right? So today in this video, I wanted to get a good understanding of, the overall sort of matchup data and hopefully showcase to you guys with like real statistics, what decks do well against the other top decks in the format, hopefully helping you guys for this weekend's Ursa Days tournament, which I highly recommend that you participate in if you have time. But if not, this next week of ranked battles, hopefully maybe you can kind of understand or see, what top decks you're going up against more often, and then make the decision as to what deck you should be playing into those ranked battles. So that's the idea here. Yesterday, we took a look at the highest average win rates, and that's a pretty important thing to look at. So in this video, we're going to be focusing less on, the total average win rates, but more so, the matchup specific win rates. So anyway, let's get right into it. Hopefully this video isn't too hard to follow. I'm going to try to, be as simple as possible when showcasing the data here and the statistics, but for the most part, don't worry about the numbers so much, but just worry about, what decks in general are doing well against the other decks. But yeah, so far in this format here on Limitless, we have 57 tournaments, almost 4,000 or 5,000 different players, and 11,000 matches. So the sample size has actually grown pretty significantly, and I think we have probably enough data, at least for like the top 5, top 6 decks, to really understand, what decks are doing well against them or not doing well against them. So let's get right into it, guys. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Join the Discord. Link will be down in the description below. And again, hopefully this video is helpful to you. It's kind of part 2. I would recommend that you guys go watch that video yesterday for the average win rates. But anyway, let's get right into it. So let's first and foremost talk about Giratina and Darkrai. This is definitely the #1 most played deck of the format, about a 13% meta share, and it has a 54% win rate. So a very strong deck here. Let's go ahead into the matchup data and statistics and see what decks are doing well or not doing well against Giratina and Darkrai. So this is immediately going to filter by, how many matches this deck has played. So of course, obviously right at the top, we're always going to see, well, not always, but the most common match for this deck is itself, right? Because it's the most popular deck being played right now. So 500 total matches. And of course, we see 254 wins, 254 losses. That's how it works, and 2 ties. So whenever a deck is playing out against itself, it's going to always have like a 50% win rate because of course, right? That's how the data works. But so don't pay attention to that. But next up, let's take a look here at Gallade. So Gallade is the second most common matchup that, Giratina and Darkrai has faced, and it has a 51.64% win rate. So a little bit favored towards Giratina and Darkrai, actually, which is kind of surprising, but Giratina does hit for weakness on Gallade. Right here, I'll highlight it. 173 wins and 158 losses, which is pretty interesting. I think that Giratina and Darkrai is not going to have too many bad matchups, but again, I think Gallade is really good into some specific decks, but again, being weak to Psychic definitely does hurt. The good thing about Giratina and Darkrai is that we have both a Dark type and Psychic type attacker, definitely really advantageous in a variety of different scenarios. So slightly favored towards Giratina and Darkrai, but I wouldn't, consider that to be a terrible matchup. And as we see here, Gyarados and Manaphy in 319 matches has a really good matchup against Giratina and Darkrai. So basically, this is a really small number because we're talking about Giratina's matchups, Giratina and Darkrai's matchups, right? So basically, when Giratina and Darkrai plays against Gyarados, it only wins 35% of the time. So 112 wins and 201 losses, which is definitely a pretty significant number here. Enough for me to say that Gyarados and Manaphy has a very good matchup against Giratina and Darkrai. So very interesting for sure, but a big number here that's really sticking out to me amongst sort of the other top decks in the format. Arceus and Dialga, again, Darkrai Giratina has a good matchup against. And then as we see here, 71 and 72, so really only a 48% win rate, but that's because of the ties. So this is against Giratina and Mewtwo. So this is an interesting one because I've been playing Giratina and Mewtwo in a really particular way that helps me counterplay to Giratina and Darkrai. It's not an auto win by any means of any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that Giratina and Mewtwo actually, on paper, actually has a pretty decent matchup against Darkrai and Giratina. That is, if you're playing potions and you're playing Pokemon Center Lady, Mewtwo with 170 HP being able to hit for 160 170 with red allows us to one-hit KO any of their Pokemon, right, with Giant Cape. So in general, as long as we're not leading off with Mewtwo, we're kind of starting, if we're starting with either of our Giratinas, I would say that Giratina Mewtwo actually has an advantageous matchup against Giratina and Darkrai. But again, the numbers actually say here in 148 matches is pretty 50-50. So I think as long as people aren't kind of tailoring their deck lists, and we'll go ahead and just quickly take a look at some of the decks here, because I just kind of maybe want to showcase this a little bit. So this list here is playing 1 Pokemon Center Lady and 2 Potions, and this is what I mean. Like, this is a Giratina and Mewtwo deck that I think is very much tailored towards this Giratina and Darkrai matchup. So I think that this list here is probably the type of list that we want to play if we're trying to counterplay Giratina and Darkrai. But not everybody, at least at this point in the format, was playing their list like that. So we're kind of ending up here with a pretty even matchup spread. Let's go into Giratina and Darkrai. Again, about a 50-50. I mean, this is 47 because it's taking into account the losses, but realistically, a pretty even matchup against Giratina and Mewtwo, which is pretty interesting. Now, Weavile and Darkrai, this deck actually has a very good win rate against, right? So 62%, and then an even better matchup against Rampardos and Lucario. So Giratina and Darkrai seemingly doing very well against these two matchups here. I think Weavile and Darkrai is very good against Giratina and Mewtwo, but in this particular matchup for Giratina and Darkrai, it does really well against these two decks here. It also does tremendously well against Articuno here, 61 and 18. So basically an auto win against Articuno is really, really interesting, and about a 50-50 against Charizard. But if we go down just a little bit to these grass type decks, I think we see something that we're gonna probably see a lot in this video. Meowscarada and Beedrill here, 19 and 37. So this deck here, Giratina and Darkrai, is really struggling against Meowscarada and Beedrill, which is definitely interesting. And then also 23 and 29, smaller sample size here, but also struggling against Meowscarada with Executor. So to me, it does seem like Meowscarada is a pretty good counter to a lot of these Giratina decks, even Giratina Mewtwo. So we'll have to see. Again, we'll look into the data. These are smaller sample sizes because less people have played Meowscarada so far, but I have seen a lot of people playing Meowscarada on the ranked battle ladder, which is definitely something to note. And then if we go down here, we see basically very good win rates against really all of these lesser played decks, with maybe some exceptions here to Meowscarada and Arceus, like I said, 4 and 16. Another instance of Meowscarada here, 9 and 15 against Arceus and Meowscarada, just similar decks, but categorized differently. So yeah, Meowscarada definitely really good for sure into Giratina and Darkrai, and I would say that that's kind of the bulk of it, right? Very balanced matchup spread here, but definitely struggles against Gyarados. And definitely a bit of a struggle here against Meowscarada and Beedrill. And I do think that the matchup against Mewtwo should be favored towards Mewtwo, but again, it really depends on how they're building their deck. So yeah, there's Giratina and Darkrai EX if you were curious about how to counterplay it or what decks were best against it. This is what the data is showing us, so hopefully this was somewhat useful to you guys. Next up, let's take a look at Gallade's matchup spreads, because Gallade is one that has really good matchups against some decks, but really bad matchups against other decks. So let's quickly take a look here. So against Giratina and Darkrai, like we just saw, a little bit not as good, 47%. Against itself, 50% of course. But if we look against Gyarados, this is really where I think Gallade shines in the most part here. 158 wins, 64 losses, right? So Gallade doing very well against Gyarados, but struggling a little bit if we go down to Mewtwo. And I think, again, that makes sense. A pure Psychic type deck doing really poorly against Giratina and Mewtwo, and I've kind of noticed that myself in all of the games that I've played Giratina and Mewtwo. We do really well against Dialga and Arceus. We knew that from the data of last format. Gallade has always been kind of a direct counter to things like Arceus and Dialga, so 103 wins, 62 losses, or 52 losses, 66% win rate, definitely strong showing here for Gallade. However, I don't really think Arceus and Dialga is, super relevant in the format, at least right now. And then if we go down some really interesting numbers, basically Auto loses against Weavile and Darkrai EX, and then also Articuno EX, 14 and 71 and 8 and 44, both 15% matchup spreads. And this is super interesting, but I think the main reason for this is because Articuno and Weavile and Darkrai are both extremely fast decks. And then they're also playing things like, multiple copies of Sabrina. So I think that overall, also like the spread damage, right? So basically the ability to sort of attack early, but also bring up those bench Pokemon, something that Weavile, Darkrai, and Articuno both do really well. These aren't massive sample sizes, but the data is skewed enough for me to realize that Gallade definitely struggles heavily in these matchups, which is very interesting. Not something that maybe we saw coming. So if you're playing Gallade, look out, or if you're trying to counter Gallade, again, Weavile, Darkrai, definitely doing really well. Same with Articuno. It seems to be one one of the few matchups that Articuno really does well against. We do really good against Charizard. That kind of also makes sense, but struggle against Meowscarada. So I think what we're going to see here, we also struggle heavily against Rampardos and Hitmonlee, which is, again, definitely an interesting scenario here. I like Rampardos and Hitmonlee personally if I'm playing Hitmonlee, but Gallade is also really, really good. But yeah, a lot of these decks are probably going to struggle against Meowscarada, and I think we're probably going to see that pretty commonly. That's something that I want to keep my eye on when I take a look at all of these numbers here. So 12 and 20 against Executor Meowscarada, 15 and 17. Pretty even overall against Meowscarada and Beedrill. So yeah, that's kind of the matchup spread against Gallade. If we're looking to counter Gallade, I would say that realistically, you know, the aggro decks and our Articuno EX 18 Trainer are by far our best options. But also, I think that Gallade is more of a deck to be sort of a counter to Gyarados and Arceus and Dialga. I think those are really the spots where it shines the most. And I think that if, you know, Gyarados really took over, or if Dialga and Arceus was a heavy player in the format, I think Gallade would be an even better choice. But right now, floating at around 51.5% win rate, so pretty decent win rate for Gallade, but again, struggling against some of the other top decks that are really on the rise in the format right now, particularly those Giratina decks, as well as, you know, Weavile Darkrai. So definitely interesting. For sure. I'm actually, so let me know in the comment section if this video you're finding useful or not. I'm actually very interested in this. I keep up with it, but I've been sort of saving, you know, I have been waiting to look at this until I make this video with you guys, because I think the data is just super, super interesting, and I'm just really excited to go ahead and take a look at it. So let's back up here to decks, and we're going to go ahead and next take a look at, we're actually going to skip over Dialga and Arceus, if I'm being honest with you, because Dialga and Arceus is 47% win rate. Amongst all of the other most played decks, it really isn't a heavy hitter or like a significant player, I think, at the top of the metagame, and it's probably going to see a very big decrease in play as time goes on. So I'm going to skip over Dialga and Arceus. Again, I don't think many people are curious about how to counter it. As we just saw, Gallade definitely does well against it, and the fighting decks do well against it. But next up, let's take a look at the matchup data for Giratina and Mewtwo. This is the deck that's 5th right now in the most played decks, but is definitely on the rise, a deck that I think is sort of settling in a really, really strong position in the format. So against Giratina and Darkrai, again, pretty 50-50. I personally think that it's in favor of Mewtwo, but again, it depends on how you build the list. And if we take a look at the Gallade matchup here in 115 matches, that's 65%. So we're doing really good against Gallade. Again, hitting for weakness with both of our Pokemon, definitely important. 74 and 38, about a 55% win rate against Gyarados. So 52 and 41, 56% win rate. Really, that's actually interesting to me. So when I'm playing against Gyarados, it doesn't feel that good to me. But again, you know, Rocky Helmet really does put in a lot of work. So I think if you're playing the matchup right, also Gyarados just has some consistency issues, so maybe an early Sabrina could also throw them off. But overall, this is an interesting bit of data for me. You know, playing this deck a lot when I go up against Gyarados, I don't really actually feel like the matchup is that much in my favor, but you know, the data says otherwise, which again is really interesting to take a look at. 52 and 40, a 56% win rate against Gyarados. 50-50 against itself, of course. And then we actually have, again, a very favorable matchup against Arceus and Dialga. I think most of the top decks are going to be doing well against Arceus and Dialga. That's probably why I think its win rate is pretty low. But if we go down here, we see a couple of big standouts. And I think a big, you know, really the biggest gaps, I would say, in this deck's matchups, which is, again, going to be against Meowscarada and Beedrill, 14 and 22. This is definitely a smaller sample size, but in my playtesting, for sure, Meowscarada definitely, we struggle pretty heavily, I would say, against Meowscarada. It's just such a good card, and again, Meowscarada does so well against so many of the other top decks in the format. And then, of course, really bad matchups here against Weavile. So if we're looking to counter Mewtwo, I would say by far the best options are you either play Meowscarada or we're playing Turbo Dark with Weavile and Darkrai. So yeah, those two decks, of course, Weavile Darkrai, fast pace, able to hit for weakness, very, very good against our deck. Early Sabrinas as well to target up that Mewtwo that's on the bench. And then Meowscarada is just Meowscarada, very good counter with Giant Cape to a lot of these decks in the top of the format. And with 10 and 11 against Meowscarada and Executor, again, very small sample sizes, so I wouldn't read too much into this. But yeah, if we go down, realistically, I would say in another 36% against Meowscarada, very small sample size. But that's kind of how I feel with Giratina and Mewtwo, is that this deck really is extremely well positioned other than those two matchups. And you know, realistically, I think a lot of people are probably going to end up playing this deck, both in the Ursa Days tournament this week, but also just in ranked battles as you kind of climb up. So if you're really looking to counter these Giratina decks, but also Giratina and Mewtwo, I would say that things like Weavile and Darkrai, but also Meowscarada and Beedrill, very, very impactful matchups to, you know, really turn the tides in your favor, I think. And again, Meowscarada is just such a good card. I expect it to also shoot up in play. So we kind of have to keep that in mind for sure. But that's the matchup spreads against Giratina and Mewtwo. Certainly interesting. We're also going to skip over Rampardos and Lucario, mainly because I don't think it's a deck that's doing very well, but also not a deck that I think a lot of people are trying to counterplay. So let's quickly take a look here at the 7th most played deck, Weavile and Darkrai, with a 53% matchup spread. So the data here is going to be smaller sample sizes, but I think we can still derive quite a bit. And yeah, Weavile and Darkrai is an interesting one. I don't think, again, it's in a position that a lot of people are looking to counterplay this deck. But I think what most people are interested with Weavile Darkrai is, the situations where it's doing best. So it struggles against Giratina and Darkrai, 45 and 75. That's a 37% win rate. It struggles against Gyarados at 35 and 54, 39% win rate. But we do extremely well against Gallade, 71 and 14. And then again, we're pretty 50-50 against Dialga Arceus, but doing really well against Mewtwo, 20 and 9. That's 69% win rate. Against Rampardos and Lucario, again, 21 and 7. Very good win rate. And then if we go down here, we're struggling against Executor Meowscarada and also Beedrill Meowscarada. So Weavile Darkrai is a very interesting deck. It's kind of a direct counter to some of the other top decks in the format, particularly, things like Gallade and Mewtwo. But other than that, it does struggle against, Giratina and Darkrai and Gyarados. So it's a very volatile deck. I think that this deck has the potential to win tournaments, really depending on what the most played decks are of that week. So I'm really interested this weekend to see sort of what happens at the Ursa Days tournament, depending on what the meta share looks like, what decks people are playing. I think that Weavile Darkrai, while having a very volatile matchup spread, can be extremely, extremely deadly if it hits the right decks in top cut. So this is definitely a deck to look out for, but very volatile matchup spreads here. Again, very low win rates against some decks, but very high against other decks, and I think that's very interesting for sure to take note of. And if we go down here again, Meowscarada, 30%, and then we're doing pretty good against Charizard, again, with that aggression, and then against Lucario, this is 8-0, so again, very small sample sizes here, so we're not going to spend too much time taking a look at the, the lesser sized sample size matchups here, but yeah, Weavile Darkrai, very strong deck to counter some specific decks, but does struggle in a lot of different scenarios as well. Okay, so the next one that I want to take a look at are actually some of these Meowscarada decks, because the sample size isn't going to be very large here. Not a lot of people have brought them to tournaments, but I still think it's going to be interesting to see their matchup spreads against some of the other top decks of the format. So let's take a look at Executor in Meowscarada and see how it does against some of the top decks here. So 29 and 23 against Giratina Darkrai, so 55%. 16 and 27, so it seems to be struggling a bit against Gyarados. 20 and 12, so again, doing well against Gallade. Struggling actually against Arceus and Dialga, again, small sample size, 13 and 17. About a 50-50 against Giratina and Mewtwo, 11 and 10. Doing well against Weavile Darkrai, losing pretty heavily to Charizard. So when I take a look at Meowscarada, I'm really kind of looking at what decks are actually still doing well against the Meowscarada decks, and to me it seems like Gyarados does well against it and Charizard does well against it, which again are very late game, high HP kind of sweeping Pokemon that I think are definitely well positioned to deal with something like Meowscarada. Now of course 5 and 2, so again the sample sizes get very small, so I'm really just looking at sort of these top 5 matchups. Yeah, but Meowscarada is certainly extremely good. This is with Executor. So next up, let's take a look at Beedrill. Meowscarada and Beedrill. Again, going to be small sample sizes here. But 37 and 19, so very good against Giratina and Darkrai. Again, very much struggling against Gyarados, 20 and 30. Doing pretty good, though, against Giratina and Mewtwo, 22 and 14. 50-50 against itself, right, for sure. And then 17 and 15, about a small sample size, but pretty even against Gallade. Doing well against Weavile and Darkrai. Doing actually well against Charizard, which is interesting. And then doing well against Dialga Arceus. So again, these are smaller sample sizes, so we don't get to put too much weight in this, in all of this data, but definitely interesting to see how impactful Meowscarada has been against some of the top decks of the format, which I just think is pretty interesting. And I guess lastly, what we can do, just because why not, is take a look at Charizard's matchups, because Charizard is still pretty funny. It's got about a 50-50 against Giratina Darkrai and against Gyarados and Manaphy, so nothing, I think, too stand out there. It does seemingly, for some reason, is losing against Dialga and Arceus, which I think is interesting for sure. And then very much losing to Gallade, which again makes sense with Hitmonlees and whatnot. Losing a lot to Rampardos, and then losing a lot to Giratina and Mewtwo. So yeah, okay. So Charizard is an interesting one. Really, it just seems to be only doing well against these grass type decks, which again kind of makes sense, I guess. But struggling against really all of the other top decks in the format, which is pretty funny. So shout out to Charizard. But anyway, yeah, I think that's honestly where we're just going to wrap up this video, mainly because, again, once you get down lower, the sample sizes really aren't that large enough to put too much weight into them. But again, I think that this video could be really useful. And again, 11,000 matches played. So if we're looking at really the top 6, top 10 most played decks, the sample sizes are large enough to get honestly a pretty good idea of what decks are doing well against those decks. So, you know, there's a lot of data that we went over in this video. I know it might be sort of confusing, and this might not be something that most people or that many people are super interested in. But again, from a competitive standpoint, and if you're really kind of looking to understand what decks are doing well against other decks, I think it's important to take a look at the data. And again, maybe you're playing the ranked ladder and all you're going up against is Giratina and Darkrai. So maybe this video is going to be really helpful to help you, you know, determine what decks maybe you should be playing to help counter those popular decks that you're seeing in ranked battles. So this data can directly translate to ranked mode, not just, you know, for the upcoming Ursa Days tournament this weekend. But again, if we're going to make our predictions towards, you know, what the metagame will look like in a couple of days, that really is sort of up to you in terms of what decks that, you know, you're choosing to play. But hopefully this data does help out. So another quick video here. I didn't want this to be too long. Again, I was thinking about including this with the previous video, but I didn't want to do like too much data, too much statistics. So hopefully just this quick video is maybe helpful to some of you guys. But if not, you know, let me know. I would love to hear your opinions down in the comment section below. I've wanted to make this video for a while. It's just a little bit tough to make videos like this because I'm saying a bunch of numbers, saying a bunch of data. Some people don't find it that interesting, but again, maybe for some people this is a very useful video. So yeah, let's get out of here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. I think I'll probably do some more ranked battle videos tomorrow. Maybe we'll have to see. Sunday's my birthday, so I'll probably take Sunday off. But yeah. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned because Monday, you know, after we get out of the weekend and the tournament goes on, we have our meta report, and then we'll do an updated tier list based off of all of the data, which I'm really, really excited about. So stay tuned. And like I said, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It means a lot to me. Comment below what your opinions are on the matchups, what you maybe found interesting or I guess surprising. Yeah, let's get out of here, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, bye.